Good afternoon and welcome to this talk as part of the York Festival of Ideas. I'm Rob Marchant. I've got the joy of being your host for the next hour. I'm a professor of tropical ecology based at the University of York in the Department of Environment and Geography. Very much a kindred spirit to today's speaker in that our disciplines are quite similar. Understanding history, understanding the histories of different parts of the world, but particularly East African histories, and understanding that interaction between people and climate. And although I've never met Martin, just speaking beforehand, there was lots of shared colleagues that we do know, friends alive and departed, unfortunately, and some really interesting anecdotes that I'm sure is going to make for a great talk. And now it's my great delight to introduce Martin Williams. He's a professor emeritus and adjunct professor of earth sciences at the University of Adelaide, Australia. Many books that he's written, many papers, really sort of leading the discipline, particularly on climate change in deserts. He's also written books on Nile waters, Saharan sands, the Nile basin. And today he's going to be talking about this remarkable book on really tracing the history of the Sahara, the largest desert in the world, and clearly showing and showcasing from his great depth of expertise about how dynamic that Sahara basin is. And the book is entitled When the Sahara Was Green. And I'd like to pass across to you, Martin.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm only sorry I can't be in York. A great deal warmer. And I have very vivid memories of my 8 years in Yorkshire, where they spoke a completely different language. So I'll get straight on with it. When the Sahara was green, our greatest desert came to be, which is the popular version. So my introduction to the Sahara was 1962, when one of my lecturers at university, I just graduated, Dick Grove, phoned up when I was in Sheffield. I was out caving in Derbyshire at the time, and said to my mother, would Martin like to go and join a British Army expedition to the Sahara, a group from Sandhurst? And essentially I said yes. When? A couple of weeks. How long? A couple of months. What do I do? Everything. So I thought, well, that's fairly succinct, and I was quite happy with that. And I set forth, and I was hooked. But when I was about 9 years old, I remember reading an account by a French geologist on the dead valleys of the Sahara. And I was living in France at the time, going to school in France. And I remember saying to myself, one day I'm going to see those for myself, which I duly did. When Dick Grove, that I could join the Sandhurst expedition, and in the middle of summer, which is not the best time to go, temperatures in the high 40s, and I was hooked. And that was a totally different landscape. Where I'm standing there at about 6,000 to 7,000 feet, a couple of thousand meters, those dunes that I'm looking across at are 100 meters high, 200 or 300 feet high. The mountain in the distance is 3 days' journey by camel. And as we traveled from the Aya Mountains across the desert, we came across more and more evidence of a former human presence and an animal presence. And I'll show you some of the evidence that we looked at as we did that. Now, I want to draw your attention to this red dot, which, if you draw a circle of radius 1,500 kilometers, you would only just intersect the North African coast and the West African coast. So that's a place called Adrabus. Adra simply means a mountain in Tamashek. And it's what geologists call a ring complex, which is where volcanic rocks have come to the surface, not quite made it, and have then been exposed. It's like looking at a bullseye from the air. And I'll take you there later, but just remember that. So what we'll try to cover, I'll talk briefly about what the Sahara is like today, which is very different to what it was like as recently as 5,000 years ago. We'll then consider the birth of the desert and, what caused it. Was it humans? Was it something else? We'll look at the evidence for alternating wet and dry climates and ask the obvious question, why? And then, which is the main focus of my talk, I'll look at the evidence of a recently wetter past when hunters were hunting for hippos in lakes across the Sahara, and a little later cattle herders were bringing in their great squads of brindle cattle. And I'll show you what the oldest complete domestic Saharan cow that's ever been found, which we found. And then we'll consider this vexed question, still debated today, still generating more noise and nonsense than light. Desiccation or exodus, humans or climate or both. Okay, so when we think of the Sahara today, the obvious image that comes to mind immediately is sand dunes. But in actual fact, dunes and sand plains only cover about a fifth of the Sahara. And it's very hard for people to actually grasp that and accept that, because this is what appears in all the films, the last 50 years, great sand dunes. Those beautiful dunes are about 200 or 300 feet high. These are acacia trees. And this is an old river bed now buried in sand. Now, in fact, most of the Sahara consists of rocks, of sandstone. That's one of the sandstones that cover about 70% of the Sahara today. That's one of the ancient rocks. It's well over 800 million years old. And you can see it's been faulted down one side. And what you have are extensive areas of mountains, rocky hills, and huge gravel plains. Here's one of them. And imagine being one of the old salt traders from the southern Sahara, having to walk across thousands of kilometers of this sort of terrain with mountains in the distance from the southern Sahara to the northern Sahara to trade a few blocks of salt. So that's one of the stony tablelands. This is interesting because it's in the Hogar Mountains. And what you're actually looking at is the core of a volcano. That's the innermost portion of a volcano, these sort of organ-like basalts. And the actual volcano itself has been eroded away. So you're just left with a bit of a platform and the core. And here's a rather poignant view across the Hogar Mountains, where Father Charles de Foucault built his hermitage in 1910, and he was murdered by Libyan Senussi dissidents in 1919, I think. He was revered by the local Tuareg. He did a great deal of doctoring. And when I visited the hermitage, there was a copy of the Geomorphology of the Hogar Mountains by Professor Pierre Rognon, whom I met a year later at a conference in Addis Ababa. And I could say I've not only seen your great big dear sea thesis, but I've actually read it and enjoyed it. This is our mental image of the Sahara. This is a rainstorm in the desert of Mauritania in 2004. We're 300 or 400 kilometers from the coast, so the rains have traveled a fair distance from the Atlantic. And these sporadic rains have replenished the water table. But it's a pretty barren landscape, and there's no permanent occupation here. A day and a half's journey from a previous slide, walking across a gravel plain, suddenly you come across this oasis. Fresh water, palm trees, and if you didn't know it was there, you could walk right past it and never see it, because it's below the surface of the ground. And what's interesting is there are little caves. There's a little cave here. This is all sandstone, quartzo sandstone, and you've got stalactites and stalagmites inside the cave, indicating that the water has actually flowed through limestone and discharged the calcium carbonate to form these beautiful stalagmites in these little caves inside. Now, the Sahara itself, depending on criteria you use, originated, for practical purposes, 7 million years ago. It was already becoming dry 20 million years ago and fluctuating. But there was a prolonged global cooling. And since then, and before then as well, the climate has alternated between wet and dry. So the big question is, why? What has caused these fluctuations? There you see a sand sea that we crossed by camel on the way to Adrabus. We'll come back to that. Now, the reason the Sahara is dry, and it's a pretty obvious and elementary reason, is that it's located in latitudes that are under the influence of dry subsiding air, which I'll show you shortly in the diagram. And it's located well away from the influence of moist air masses. I showed you at the beginning that we're 1,500 kilometers from the nearest bit of sea. So there are sound geographical reasons why the Sahara is arid, and they have nothing to do with human impact. And it's been arid well before the first hominids set foot on this planet. So you're looking at an old dry lake bed there, dunes in the background. This is the Eastern Sahara, Northern Sudan, and you can see the cracks filled with sand. Now, at the present time, when the sun is overhead at the equator, it heats up the air rises, moist air, and as it rises, because of the rotation of the Earth, it moves north and south. And as it moves, it sheds its air. How do I get back? There we go. And by the time it gets into these subtropical latitudes, it's dry subsiding air. So it acts like a gigantic desiccator. So you have the Sahara itself, you have the deserts of Arabia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, right across through India, and down in the southern hemisphere, of course, the Atacama, Australian deserts, and the deserts of southern Africa. So good geographical reasons for why the deserts are dry and why they are where they are today. Now let's go back in time 420 million years, at which time south of the equator there was a huge megacontinent known as Gondwana or Gondwana land, which consisted of very stable, resistant ancient rocks, the West African Craton, Sahara Craton, the Amazon, Congo. These are all joined together, India likewise. Now, I'm going to move rapidly to 60 million years ago. And note where the equator is now. This megacontinent has split up, and the equator is running across what is now the heart of the Sahara. So at this time, 60 million through to about 40, 45 million years ago, the whole of Saharan Africa was covered in equatorial rainforest. Deep weathering, totally different environment, different fauna, different flora, different geography altogether. Now, Africa was moving north at about the rate that my daughter's fingernails grow, or used to in her younger days, at about 4 to 5 centimeters a year. And that has taken Africa out of the equatorial zone and into drier latitudes. So the northward movement of Africa, or more strictly the African tectonic plate, has brought North Africa into dry tropical latitudes. Now, at this time, there was a huge ocean to the north, where the Mediterranean now is, extending right across to India, called the Tethys Sea. And as the Tethys shrank, it deprived the Sahara, the northern Sahara in particular, of a major source of moist air. So there was one reason for the desiccation of the Sahara. And also at this time, the surrounding oceans became cooler and cooler. Ice was building up over Antarctica. And as the oceans became cooler, of course, there was less evaporation and there was less moisture available to bring rain to the Sahara. So there are 4 or 5 major reasons why the Sahara is dry. And none of them have anything to do with humans. So that's my key point. Now, during wetter phases, huge rivers flowed from these mountains, like the Hogar Mountains, nearly 3,000 meters high, the Tibesti, Jebel Mara volcano in Darfur in Western Sudan, over 3,000 meters. And they flowed either to the Mediterranean or down into the Atlantic. And the reason for the distribution of these volcanic mountains, including the Cameroon Mountains right across into Eastern Sudan, are these ancient zones of weakness in the crust called lineaments, which you find in rocks over 500 million years old. And as a consequence, they're periodically reactivated and become the focus of volcanic activity. So Jebel Mara volcano, which is a huge volcano in Western Sudan, is at the intersection between 2 of these groups of lineaments, one trending that way and one trending this way. And these ancient structures have influenced the pattern, the Nile, and you can see the big bend here and there and there. These all reflect zones of weakness in the crust that have been periodically reactivated. Okay, now what has controlled these wet and dry phases? The first is changes in the tilt of the Earth's axis and the shape of the path of the Earth around the sun, which is elliptical. It's sometimes more circular, sometimes less so. We'll look at that in a moment. And that controls the amount of solar radiation received at different times by the Earth at different latitudes. When the tropics receive more solar radiation, then the wet season lasts longer, the summer wet season. The rainstorms are more intense, and the summer rains push much further into the Sahara. And conversely, when the tropics receive less solar radiation, shorter wet season, fewer and less intense rainstorms, and less rain moving into the Sahara. Now, there are three major cycles. There's what we call the orbital eccentricity cycle, which doesn't mean that you're cross-eyed. It's a 100,000-year cycle, on average, 96,600. There's the tilt of the Earth's axis, which is quite important. That's 40,000 years. If there were no tilt and the axis was vertical, there'd be no summer and winter. There'd be no seasons. And then the season of the year in which the Earth is closest to the sun, which is actually quite variable between about 16 and 28,000. But that's a very important one. That's 20,000 on average, because that really determines the climate in the Sahara. So schematically, there's the sun. That's when it's closest, peri, 147.1 million kilometers. That's when it's furthest from the sun, 152.1. Here's a bit of axial wobble. The tilt of the axis is now about 23, 27, but has fluctuated through time. And then there's the timing that when the Earth itself is closest to the sun. So those three together determine the glacial and interglacial cycles. Now just look at the most recent one. Schematically, that's from 125,000, when sea level around the globe was between about 5 and 8 or 9 meters higher than today, and there was no ice in Greenland. And then what you can see is that a series of low sea levels getting lower and lower, eventually getting down to what I call B, which was about 20,000 years ago, 25,000. And at that time, global sea levels were 125 meters lower and then rose quite rapidly. And these are the little precessional cycles, the 20,000-year cycles. And you've had this pattern operating for the last 600,000-700,000 years, and before that, shorter cycles. So it's a bit like big fleas had little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas had little fleas, and so ad infinitum. We've got a whole series of these cycles of varying lengths. Now, I want to come to actually some of the evidence for a once wetter Sahara, which was between 15,000 and 5,000 years ago. So here's an old lake bed in the Eastern Sahara. That's diatomite. There's a vehicle for scale and a Neil Monroe keeping out of the sun. Now, when this lake was in existence, of course, these beds were the lowest point in the landscape. And today, because the margins of the lake have been blown away by the wind, they are now the highest point in the landscape. So you've had inversion of relief. And running right across the Sahara, you've got a whole series of old riverbeds cemented with silica, carbonate, iron, now standing proud in the landscape when once they were the lowest point in the landscape. So you've had this dramatic inversion of relief, some of it going back millions of years and some of it quite recent. Now this, on the face of it, looks a little bit formidable, but I'll explain it, or try to. Today, the southern limit of active desert dunes, which is the solid black line, here, that one, it roughly coincides with the 150 millimeter rainfall Isa Hyatt, the zone of equal rainfall. And what's interesting is that you've got fixed dunes, vegetated, stable dunes, extending down to areas that today get about a meter of rain. That's a lot of rain. And extending up to 1,000 kilometers, but mostly 500 or 600 kilometers south of the present limit. And periodically, during drier climatic intervals, the vegetation cover on the dunes dies, the soils that formed break down and are eroded, and the dunes are reactivated. But it doesn't mean to say the Sahara is actually literally migrating 1,000 kilometers to the south. It's being periodically reactivated, just as I am with a little sip of Adelaide water. Okay. 300 kilometers from the Nile, you can see part of a fossil Nile perch, which was about 6 foot long, 2 meters long, and about 5,000 years old, 9,000 years old, and 300 kilometers from the river today. So these are big fish, and there were rivers flowing at the time and were active, but have since not been active. Now this is in the just east of the Aya Mountains, where we traveled by camel. Present day river channel, which flows about once every 20 years, is mainly gravel and sand. On this low terrace, which is an old floodplain, you've got Neolithic remains, and they're about 5,000 years old. And I'll show you some of those in a moment. On this floodplain, which is now a river terrace, these dunes are about 100 meters high. You have late Stone Age artifacts. Oh, I could do with one of those as well. You're tempting me. And they're about 15,000. So what's interesting about them is that they consist of very finely laminated silt and clay. So when this river was active, 15 to 20,000 years ago, it was carrying a very different load. It was a suspension load river, carrying mud, basically, not sand or gravel. So that's another line of evidence. But to me, the most compelling evidence, this is right on the border between Libya, Sudan, and Egypt, Jebel Uwainat. Now in Arabic, Uwainat means the little springs, and Jebel means mountain. And there are over 1,000 of these magnificent rock paintings of domestic cattle. They're about 5,000 years old. You can see the hunters and the cattle men. You can see a little cattle camp. You can see mothers and babies on occasions, dogs, and you can see fat-tailed sheep. No, that's an error, sorry. Go back. That's part of the cow. And you find hundreds of these across the Sahara. Now, you could argue that the few homesick painters from the south came up and painted their recollection of what they could see further south. But you also, of course, find the fossil remains. So it's not as if they're just painting something from memory, peculiar reasons. Okay, now 2,000 kilometers from that spot in southern Algeria, in the Tessely, you have these paintings of women in their finery, sometimes with babies, astride oxen. And the oxen themselves invariably have well decorated, and they have women, babies. And that particular painting is about 2,500 years old. Now, to this day, the Bagara cattle herders of Western Sudan migrate seasonally. During the wet season, they go north, and the women and the babies in their finery travel on oxen. So there is a tradition going back at least 2,500 years that persists until today. Now, we'll come to some rock engravings. I haven't the faintest idea what these are. I've called them mythical figures, where you see they appear to be boxing. That's right down in the southern Libyan desert. They could be meerkats. They look a bit like it, but I've no idea. This is easier to interpret. There's a giraffe, local guide, and here you see an elephant and a man with a throwing stick. These are probably different ages, judging from the preservation. And a couple of antelopes with another local guide. And you find the fossil remains of these creatures. It's not simply that you find, these are all about 15,000 years or more old. Now, I want to take you on a journey. Adrabus is our destination. It's a ring complex. It's a particular type of geological formation that from the air looks a bit like a bullseye. I'll show you in a moment. And we're now, if you draw a circle of radius 1,500 kilometers, you're only just touching the coast. There's Adrabus itself, pretty arid, no water, very little vegetation, no human inhabitants. So we worked there for 3 months in 1970. And I'll show you some of the things that we discovered. This is en route to Adrabus, Desmond Clark and myself, 3-day journey. Zoe Binweni is our Tuareg guide. And on the way, Professor Desmond Clark, Professor of Archaeology at Berkeley, spotted a bit of pot protruding from the sand. Zoe is watching in trance, convinced we're digging for gold. The camel is watching rather more aloofly. And what came is that the pot, in fact, was a cover. It was upside down, sitting on another pot with Desmond's sheath knife scale. And inside the lower pot, beautifully decorated, was the dried fruit of Celtis integrifolia, which today needs about 450 millimeters of rain a year to flourish. So this 5,000-year pot is telling us that when it was put there, this region was able to support woodland and forest and was receiving about 450 millimeters of rain. Beneath that, there was a human burial, which I hope is still there because we didn't have the wherewithal to excavate at that stage. Now, on the first morning at Adrabus, just as the sun was rising, we spotted a little spot of white poking out of this dark grey-brown clay. 14 days later, using dental picks, out came the oldest complete domestic Neolithic cow that's ever been recovered from the Sahara. There it is again, short-horned cow, Bos brachyceros. And in addition to finding Neolithic hearths, middens, fireplaces, bones of fish, bones of crocodile and hippo and Nile perch, we found literally hundreds of these early Stone Age hand axes. And that's about 500,000 years old. What was interesting is they've been set sideways, embedded in the clay, And if you wrap the soles of your feet against them, you can use them as a saw. You can saw ligaments, hide, bone. Now here's an array of rather mixed stone tools. You can see these hollow-based arrowheads made of a beautiful silicified vitric tuff. You can see spear points. Whoops. I keep doing that, which is a pity. Get back. There we go. A knife. We eventually located the source of the rock that was used to make this knife. Grindstones for grinding wild cereal grasses. And we found the remains of these on the pottery, the seeds. You've got a series. This is an adze, which Nile boat builders, carpenters use today when they're making dugout canoes, and then various cutting tools. So that was Neolithic and Mesolithic, quite a mixed bag. There were thousands upon thousands of these. So we had 3 months to excavate. Up in the Tassili plateau in southern Algeria, you find these quite remarkable engravings of chariots. And the Romans, when they arrived in North Africa 2,000 years ago, found that the Garamantes, who were using chariots from about 2,500 years onwards, the horse was brought in by the Hyksos when they moved into Egypt. Anyway, the Garamantes were using underground sources of water and were fighting all the neighboring tribes, and the Romans took exception to that and eventually pacified, or at least subdued, the Garamantes. It took a while. Now I'm going to suggest, I'll say it very firmly, that in spite of recurrent claims to the contrary, that humans actually created the desert, there is no compelling evidence that humans caused the Sahara to become arid. It was arid before people were here and will be again. Now, the reason why the reason for these climatic fluctuations are straightforward, and they're linked to changes in the tilt of the Earth's axis. And when the climate is drier, it's when the tropical zone receives less solar radiation. When it's wetter, different story. Stronger monsoon, wetter Sahara. And the previously more humid desert regions of India and China that were wetter between 15 and 5,000 years ago, not continuously, there were quite long dry periods in that interval of time, dried out at the same time as the Sahara. So if you're going to argue that humans created the Sahara, you have to say, well, why was it dry well before humans appeared? Why was it drying out in both hemispheres synchronously? And why was the pattern of climatic changes also synchronous right across from North Africa, through Somalia, into India, and into China? And why has this been the case for millions and millions of years? Now, I just want to show you these two little figures from this one little rock engraving. It's about 1,000 years old in the Aya Mountains. And you can see two elaborate figures with rather nice headdresses. This chap is clutching a rather small horse. Now, some years ago, Erich von Däniken, who served time for fraud in Zurich jail, wrote a book called The Chariot of the Gods. It was a bestseller. And he used this evidence, so-called, these were spacemen. And this was the space helmet. These were their antennae. And they landed on the Earth, brought their spacecraft with them. To which I would ask, well, these superior beings, why did they need horses? And I've never come across a suitable reply. Okay, so the effective start of the Sahara was about 7 million years ago, when the oceans were cooling, then when there was less evaporation, and the Tethys Sea was shrinking, and North Africa was being deprived of moist air. And since then, there's been a succession of alternating wet and dry phases. And the onset of aridity in the Sahara was about 4,500 years ago and was not caused by humans. So there's my camel in the middle, our guide. So that's it. Thank you.
Amazing tour through history and across the Sahara, some amazing landscapes that really was brought to life. So we've got a number of questions that have come into the chat. I'll just work my way down through these. So first of all, from Suyala, about tools and techniques. So they ask, what techniques and technologies are used to study ancient climates and landscapes in the arid regions like the Sahara? So what tools, techniques, methods do you find particularly useful? And what are some of their challenges, I guess, as well?
I could spend the rest of the evening answering that question.
But briefly.
The landforms, first of all, the obvious difference between old lake deposits, dunes, old river deposits, that's a start. Then fossil soils. By training, I was a soil surveyor in my younger days, working in the blue and white Nile. So soils can tell you quite a bit too. Then there's the evidence from archaeological remains. There's evidence from basic physics, which is the dating of what you're looking at, using radiocarbon dating, using luminescence dating, which is a clever technique that my wife worked on for a number of years, telling you when a grain of sand was last exposed to sunlight, and that ideally can take you back 1 million years. Radiocarbon dating basically tells you when an organism, a plant or an animal died and ceased ingesting radioactive carbon. We all breathe in trace elements, tiny amounts of radioactive carbon. And once we die, it decays, and that it'll take you back about 50,000 years. There are various other methods of dating. The archaeological evidence is not just the stone tools, but what the people ate, the remains of fish, remains of turtles, remains of hippos. In one of the lakes, we found coprolites, which are a polite way of saying what crocodiles were excreting. And in these crocodile coprolites, there was fossil pollen. And the pollen was actually telling us what the vegetation was. My favorite bit of evidence, which I've used in the Nile Basin for many years, freshwater aquatic snail shells. Some of these are permanent water, some of them are amphibious, and then there are land snails. Now, if there are land snails present, you can make a pretty sensible guess as to what the likely rainfall was in the climate. So the short answer is you use every technique, every hook in the book, every technique you can possibly use, from chemistry, stable isotopes, carbon, oxygen, right through to something as basic as a buried sand dune or a buried riverbed or bits of an old lake bed. And invariably you're never relying on one bit of evidence alone. And ideally, each bit of evidence should be dated independently, which is a challenge. So you have to go in there with a pretty open mind, but you have to be ready to spot a millimeter piece of white horned core poking up from the sand. And thank your dentist for providing you with lots of dental picks. Does that answer the question?
I think that no, I think that does. And like you say, it's one of those questions that can go on and on, because I guess you could spend hours talking about one technique and the challenges and applications of it. And I guess, much like me, one of the nice things that you must have experienced over your career is more and more lines of evidence coming together, so that you're able to move a little bit to a much more interpretive type framework than purely just describing what was where and when those artifacts were in place. So there's a little bit of a follow-on question about specifically on the stone axes. So how did you date those? How were you able to be so precise with your dating of the stone artifacts?
Yes, the ones we found in at Adrabus, we couldn't, of course, date directly. We could date them only in a relative sense by dating the individual layers of sediment in which they're embedded. But in places like Olduvai, they've been directly dated by dating the volcanic rocks above and beneath them. So it was by analogy with what had been found in Tanzania and other parts of East Africa. So the short answer is we couldn't date those directly. We could date the Neolithic and the Mesolithic using radiocarbon dating. And very much later, I could use luminescence dating. So never throw away samples. I've kept my samples for 40, 50 years.
I think
that's the answer to that one.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great lesson, and lesson to us all. And again, new techniques become more refined as well, don't they? So a question about more sort of forward-looking perspectives. So obviously there's the Great Green Wall. So there's reforestation of that sort of Sahelian area to the south of the Sahara. Do you feel as though that's likely to be successful, or do you have a view on if that's going to be successful or not?
One thing you have to remember about the Sahara, particularly the northern southern fringes of the Sahara, is that the climate is always fluctuating. So every 30 years or so, in the last 100 years, you've had wetter intervals and drier intervals. And during those drier intervals, there's a change in wind direction. So the snag with the shelter belt approach is that it's fine if the wind direction is constant. But what happens when you move to a time when the winds have changed direction and are blowing sand the other way? That's one problem. In China, for a while, when I worked in Inner Mongolia, shelter belts were all the rage. But during the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese had killed the birds on the grounds that birds were eating the cereal seeds and so on. And the birds actually were eating the insects that killed the trees. So once the birds been killed, the trees died. So these shelter belts that were being put up at huge expense proved to be worthless. So I'm not a great believer in shelter belts as such. You can stabilize dunes in clever ways, pioneered by the Russians claim it was them, the Chinese claim it was them. I have no idea who, but what you can do is build little meter by meter squares and put in stalks of cereal grasses, wild sorghum, wild millet, and so on. And that'll trap dust, and the dust will be washed down during occasional rainstorms, and eventually a soil will form. And once the soil forms, then you've stabilized the dune. But if the Sahara has anything to tell us, it's that the climate has alternated repeatedly. Even in the last 10,000 years, you've had centennial scale fluctuations. So if you're building something, it might be fine 30 years, present conditions, but then the winds change and you've lost out.
Maybe a related question, Martin, was somebody asked it, Yolata actually said, she asks, is it possible for the Sahara to be green again into the future?
Yes, I deal with this in the epilogue to my book. It'll take a very long time. The reason the Sahara is alternating between wet and dry is linked to these astronomical cycles, which are quite long. So at the moment, other things being equal, we're heading towards the next glacial maximum. And then after that, depending on how much human impact there is, back again to wetter conditions. So I wouldn't hold your breath and wait. And nor do I think it makes good economic sense to try and plant trees in the middle of a desert when you might get a few millimeters of rain every 20 years. You know, there are better things to do with deserts. And of course, there's underground water. And the local people have learned to use that and adapt to it, and so have the plants and the animals. So we can learn a great deal by looking at how plants have adapted, how animals have adapted, how humans, societies have adapted, because fundamentally, confronted with a major change, like a change from wet to dry, you've got three options. You can migrate, which most people with any sense did. You can adapt, which some did, moved up into the highlands, or you can become extinct. And a lot of them did. So those are your options. So I wouldn't be trying to plant trees all over the Sahara.
No, clearly those options also, you know, resonate very much in contemporary world about some of the climate challenges, I guess, that you know, different parts of the world are facing. So maybe the last question, I know we're unfortunately very short for time, we could go on and on and on talking about this subject. And it was really just a question about Egypt. So obviously you focused much more on in the central and sort of northern Sahara. Are there records from Egypt about how green the Sahara was, and how do you think that may have connected into the growth of the Egyptian civilization? You know, if the Egyptian civilization grew around about, say, about 5,000 years ago, and that connects into that sort of green Sahara period.
Yes.
So
when the Sahara was wetter, up until about 5,000 years ago, people moved out of the Nile Valley into the Sahara, into the Eastern Sahara. And once the Eastern Sahara became hyper-arid, which was from about 5,000 to 4,500 onwards, they moved back to the Nile Basin. The early Egyptians used some very basic forms of irrigation. And really wasn't until they developed a centralized society and began cutting canals and diverting water on a perennial basis from the Nile that they began an urban civilization from about 5,000 years onwards. Now, there was a recent paper that attracted a lot of attention in the world press, saying ancient Nile channel explains mysteries of pyramids. Well, I'm always skeptical of that sort of headline. And I was asked to comment, which I politely declined on the grounds it was beyond my expertise. But there's an abandoned channel of the Nile with a whole series of pyramids alongside it in what is now hyper-arid desert. But the time that those pyramids were built, which was about 4,600 years ago, it was wetter, and that particular channel of the Nile was flowing. And in fact, if you look at the early French maps, one of which was dated 1762, French surveyors 300 years ago were well aware of this ancient channel. So this paper that's suddenly been published, claiming to have found an abandoned channel using geophysics and dating, they've rediscovered the wheel. They've dated it, but already the knowledge of that channel was known. When the channel itself dried out, then the pyramids were left high and dry. And you've got this sort of thing throughout the Nile Valley. So I've skimmed off a bit there, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, and again, amazing insights, Martin, and it really shows those connections between the environment and clearly a very dynamic and changing environment, and societal response and management of some of those challenges. So really, unfortunately, we didn't get to the last couple of questions. So please, apologies for that. But we have run out of time. But I would just like to thank you, Martin, for a fantastic insight into clearly a landscape you have a lot of passion for, a lot of knowledge on. And I've thoroughly enjoyed the last hour having to navigate around the ship as students move around me. But I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you very much. I certainly enjoyed the read. It's an area which I certainly I haven't had the pleasure of visiting directly, but certainly have an interest in it. And I think lots and lots of lessons to be learned for some of the contemporary issues and challenges that we're facing. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and thank you to the audience. It was a really nice session.